Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
White isn't appropriate for you, my sister whispered, her lips barely moving, a smug little smirk curling at the corners, like she'd just won a silent argument I didn't even know we were having. She said it so sweetly, like a waitress letting you know they're out of your favorite dish. All sugar on top, but pure vinegar underneath. I didn't respond. I just nodded like it didn't hit me, like it didn't sting the way it did, and turned to head toward the bathroom with the same polite smile I'd used all morning. But the truth? I felt my face burn. Not with shame, with something else. That deep, aching mix of humiliation and rage that only family can drag out of you in seconds flat. I hadn't even wanted to come to her wedding. I'd stared at that ivory invitation for 3 straight days, tossed it in the trash, fished it back out again, then let it sit on my kitchen counter until the RSVP deadline passed, and guilt finally pried it open like a damn crowbar. The truth was, I hadn't been home in almost 6 years. Not since Dad's funeral, and even then, I hadn't stayed long. A weekend, tops. Just enough time for the old wounds to scab back over. And yet, despite all that space, it took less than 10 minutes back under the same roof for those scabs to rip clean open. Danielle's wedding was held in some overpriced barn-style venue in the Virginia countryside, the kind with string lights in the rafters, and guests pretending to be country chic while sipping $10 cocktails. Everyone was smiling and fake laughing and hugging like some damn Hallmark movie, and I just stood there in the middle of it all like an outsider with the wrong script. I hadn't seen most of these people in years. Some I hadn't seen since high school. Others, like my Aunt Lillian or our old neighbor Mrs. Draper, greeted me like I was a ghost who'd suddenly stepped out of a war zone, which, in some ways, wasn't far from the truth. I wore a simple white blouse and a pale beige skirt. Nothing flashy, nothing bridal, just clean, plain, and appropriate. I'd chosen it carefully. I didn't want to draw attention. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to remind anyone that I'd once been the kind of person who carried a rifle and patched up bleeding limbs in the back of a transport truck somewhere dusty and hot, while everyone else was at college keg parties. And maybe that's what set her off. Maybe the sight of me in that modest white top, just enough to toe the line of formality without stepping over it, was all it took to trigger the same buried resentment she'd been nursing since we were kids. Or maybe she'd planned it all along. Danielle always knew how to dig the knife in with a smile. She never yelled, never cursed. No, she preferred the slow poison over the bullet, quieter, deadlier. When she pulled me aside, just moments before the guests were set to take their seats, she didn't make a scene. She just leaned in, her breath warm against my cheek, and whispered, "White isn't appropriate for you." Like I was the one trying to upstage her. Like I was the one with something to prove. As if she hadn't known exactly what she was doing by seating me near the front, right where everyone would see me. As if she hadn't picked out the bridesmaids' dresses in baby pink, just a shade lighter than the one I wore to her prom. Just coincidence, I'm sure. And the way she smiled when she said it, that little half smirk, like she'd finally scored the winning point in a game I'd stopped playing years ago, that was the part that burned. Not the words, not even the implication, but the victory in her eyes. Do you have a sibling like that? One who's always polished, always perfect, always playing the role while you're in the background trying not to trip over the damn curtain? Have you ever swallowed your own pride just to keep the peace, just to show up, just to sit quietly at a table full of people who still talk about the time your sister made the cheer squad while you were patching blisters at basic training? Because if you have, you know exactly what that moment feels like. That white-hot silence behind your rib cage. That internal scream that never quite makes it out of your throat. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I just smiled, nodded once like I understood, and walked away. I found the nearest bathroom, locked the door behind me, and stared at my reflection. 38 years old, Navy vet, 3 tours, 2 commendations, 1 metal rod in my left knee, and somehow still being told what's appropriate by the little sister who once stole my diary and read it out loud at a birthday party. I didn't cry, I didn't curse. I didn't throw anything, even though I wanted to. Instead, I reached into the garment bag I'd packed as a backup. I hadn't planned to wear it, not unless something went wrong, but maybe deep down I'd always known it would. I unzipped the bag, slid out the sharp navy blue uniform with the polished buttons and the weight of a dozen years sewn into every seam. Dress blues, every stitch said, "I earned this." As I buttoned it up, something inside me settled. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. Danielle wanted me to change, so I did, but not the way she expected. When I stepped back out of that bathroom, every eye in the room turned. And that's when things really started to get interesting. The moment I stepped out of the bathroom and into that reception hall, something in the air shifted, not in the loud, dramatic way you'd see in a movie. No crashing glasses or gasps echoing off the walls, but in that thick, heavy stillness that descends when a room full of people collectively stops talking, when conversations dry up mid-sentence and heads turn. Not because someone asked them to, but because they can't help themselves. That's the power of a navy dress uniform. You don't need to speak when you wear one. It speaks for you. I didn't strut and I sure as hell didn't smile. I just walked slowly, deliberately, with that quiet weight in my step that comes from too many hours on duty and too many mornings spent squaring your shoulders even when the only thing you wanted to do was fall apart. Every step I took echoed slightly against the hardwood floors, softened only by the low shuffle of people rising. Yes, rising, and from their chairs, one by one, like a wave of understanding had rolled through them and knocked something loose in their collective chest. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, that maybe I'd misunderstood the shift in atmosphere and my nerves were playing tricks on me, building tension where there was none. But then I saw Uncle Rick. Not really my uncle, but the kind of family friend who always smelled like motor oil and grilled steak, stand up with his hands clasped over his heart, eyes shining a little too brightly for someone who'd only had one glass of champagne. He nodded once, slow and respectful, and that was when I realized this wasn't just about the uniform. This was about what it meant, and what it said without saying a damn thing. The applause didn't start all at once. It began with a single pair of hands. I think it was Mrs. Draper, actually, clapping awkwardly but with intention, followed by a second, and then a third, until the sound of it filled the barn in that strange, almost surreal way that made it feel like I wasn't really there, like I was watching myself from a distance. I could see Danielle standing near the head table, bouquet dangling awkwardly from her hand, mouth slightly open like she'd just tasted something sour. Her smile, the one she'd worn all day like armor, was gone. And in that moment, I remembered something she'd once said to me during one of our rare phone calls years ago, back when I was still overseas and we were pretending to be sisters again for the sake of Mom's birthday. "You always had to make it about you," she'd said, laughing lightly, but there had been a jagged edge to her voice, like broken glass wrapped in velvet. At the time, I'd brushed it off, assuming it was just her way of venting, of trying to express whatever jealousy or confusion she'd bottled up inside without sounding too obvious. But now, standing in front of her in full uniform, I realized she hadn't been joking. She really believed it. She thought I craved attention, that every choice I made, joining the Navy, disappearing for years, even showing up to her wedding, was part of some calculated bid to steal the spotlight from her. That was the moment I felt it. Not just the sting of her words, but the weight of every unspoken resentment she'd buried under layers of fake smiles and carefully curated social media posts. She saw me as a threat, not because I was loud or flashy or dramatic, but because I didn't need to be. Because when you've spent your life learning how to stand alone, you carry a kind of strength that makes others uncomfortable, especially the ones who've only ever known how to be seen through someone else's applause. I took my seat quietly at the front, ignoring the eyes still watching me, pretending I didn't notice the photographers subtly redirecting their lenses, catching the moment like it mattered more than the cake cutting or the bride's first dance. Danielle hadn't moved. Her smile was back now, forced and brittle, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that's stretched so tight it might snap. She looked at me once, not for long, but long enough, and in that look, I saw not just anger, but confusion, betrayal, maybe even fear. The speeches were supposed to start next, and I could feel the tension buzzing under the surface as Danielle's new husband, Jared, stepped up to the mic and tried to salvage the moment with a few awkward jokes and an overly enthusiastic toast. People laughed, but it was a shallow, nervous kind of laughter, like they were trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a moment that didn't belong in the script. I didn't clap. I just sat still, sipping my water, trying to quiet the storm swirling in my chest, trying to convince myself that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I hadn't deliberately tried to take anything from her. And the truth, I hadn't. I'd changed because she asked me to. She didn't like what I was wearing, so I gave her something else. Something true, something real, something earned. Still, as I watched her plaster that smile back onto her face and move through the rest of the evening like a performer desperate to finish her final act, I knew this wasn't over. Not for her, not for me the applause had stopped, but the echoes of it still hung in the air, like gunpowder after a shot's been fired. You could ignore it, pretend it didn't happen, but everyone knew it had. And I had a feeling Danielle wasn't done with me yet. There's something unnerving about being clapped for when you didn't ask for it, didn't expect it, and certainly didn't dress yourself that morning with any intention of drawing attention, especially not at someone else's wedding, particularly when that someone is your younger sister, the same girl who used to sob if I so much as wore the same color shoes to her piano recitals. As I sat there in my dress blues, the weight of the moment still pressing down on my chest like a slow-building migraine, I realized that the applause wasn't really for me. Not as a person, not as Kat the sister, or Kat the guest who showed up late and quietly kept to herself. No, they were applauding something larger, something I had tried to carry quietly for more than a decade. Something stitched into my uniform that spoke of deployments, funerals, training exercises gone sideways, moments of silent fear and louder-than-hell courage. And they were recognizing that, not me. And that's why it stung and soothed at the same time. I kept my eyes low, not because I was ashamed, but because I could feel Danielle's gaze burning a hole through the side of my head. That kind of gaze that makes the skin on your cheekbones tighten and your throat itch like you've swallowed something bitter. And when I finally looked up just for a second, our eyes met across the room, and I saw her expression, that stunned, wounded pride, twisted not with embarrassment but with betrayal. The kind that comes when someone ruins your perfect day by simply existing more loudly than you wanted them to. It wasn't my fault. I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, hadn't come in with some calculated plan to sabotage her carefully curated wedding with my presence. But once again, I had become the focal point without ever trying to be, and in our family, that had always been a mortal sin when committed by anyone other than Danielle. I watched as her smile dropped momentarily, just enough for me to see the real emotion crawling underneath. Not hatred, not even anger, but something colder. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone finally sees the truth of another person, unfiltered and undeniable, and realizes that maybe they've spent their whole life underestimating the wrong person. The clapping eventually died down, replaced by an awkward shuffling of feet and a few forced chuckles as people tried to reset the tone, to swing the mood back toward joy, back toward champagne and speeches and choreographed first dances. But the shift had happened, and there was no pretending it hadn't. Jared, poor guy, tried to overcompensate by turning up the charm, raising his glass in a loud toast that felt more like a lifeline than a celebration. And I knew then that he had no idea what he'd just walked into, no clue that his new bride's fragile grip on the spotlight had just been cracked, not by an argument or a scandal, but by a single quiet presence that didn't fit into her fairy tale narrative. When the toast ended and people returned to their plates and drinks, I stayed seated, letting the buzz of conversation wash over me like static, my thoughts drifting to a memory I hadn't touched in years. The moment during my second deployment, when I found myself crouched behind a makeshift wall of cinder blocks, heart pounding so hard I thought it might rip through my ribs, waiting for the dust to settle after an explosion had knocked our convoy sideways. I remembered the way the world had gone silent, not because there was no sound, but because my body had entered that surreal, detached state where your mind feels like it's watching your life from 10 feet above. That's how I felt now, not scared, not proud, just dislocated. Danielle approached during the cake cutting. She didn't smile, didn't pretend to be cheerful, didn't play the gracious bride. She simply stood beside me, eyes narrowed, voice low enough to avoid attention, and said, "You couldn't let me have this one day, could you?" Her voice didn't tremble, but there was a tightness in it that betrayed the cracks beneath her practiced calm, and for once she didn't bother to hide the resentment. She let it bleed out of her words like venom leaking from an old wound. I turned slowly, making sure no one else was watching, and replied in the same low tone, "I wasn't trying to take anything from you. You asked me to change. I did. I didn't say it with malice, didn't inject it with sarcasm or smugness, just stated it like a fact because that's all it was. I could have worn that uniform the minute I arrived, could have made a point out of it, but I hadn't. I had come in quietly, respectfully, choosing something soft and neutral because despite everything, I didn't want to steal her day." Her face twisted for half a second before she smoothed it back over, like she was mentally pulling herself together with invisible threads. And without another word, she walked away. Not stomped, not stormed, just left. And that told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. There were still hours left in the reception, but for me, the night was already sealed. I'd worn my truth on my sleeve, and the room had responded, not because they loved me or knew me, but because the truth, when finally allowed to breathe, has a way of commanding its own applause. And Danielle, she wasn't done yet. I could feel it. There's a certain kind of silence that creeps in after a confrontation like the one Danielle and I had by the cake table. Not the polite silence of social restraint, or the empty quiet of people who don't know what to say, but that charged, invisible hum of tension that clings to your skin like humidity in the middle of July. A silence that follows you like a shadow, weighing heavier with each step, reminding you that something beneath the surface just cracked, and no one has the courage to acknowledge it aloud. I stayed at my table after she walked away, feigning interest in the half-melted dessert on my plate, pretending to check my phone, anything to avoid the inevitable parade of glances and murmurs that would ripple through the guests, who had all seen just enough to know something was off, but not enough to understand the depth of what had just passed between us. It wasn't until an hour later, long after the bouquet toss, and just before the DJ transitioned from Sinatra into some god-awful early 2000s pop medley, that I found myself face to face with Melanie Barnes, one of Danielle's oldest friends. Not a bridesmaid, but the kind of person who lingered in the bridal orbit long enough to absorb every secret, every outburst, every whispered breakdown behind closed doors. I hadn't expected her to talk to me, much less lean in and whisper with a tone so cautious it felt like she was testing the air for landmines. "You know she tried to join the Navy once, right?" she said, eyes darting toward the dance floor, where Danielle spun with her new husband, in a display that felt so choreographed it could have been lifted from a Pinterest board. Right after high school, didn't even make it through the recruitment process, flat feet, bad knee, something like that, she was devastated. At first I thought Melanie was joking, or worse, trying to stir the pot, but the way she said it, low, soft, like she wasn't supposed to, made me pause, because it explained so much that had never quite made sense before. It wasn't just jealousy. It wasn't just that I had done something she couldn't. It was that I had embodied a path she once dreamed of but couldn't follow, and rather than grieve it like a loss, she had buried it in bitterness and painted over it with glitter and accolades, hoping the world would never know how deeply that rejection had bruised her. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to process the flood of implications. And the more I thought about it, the more everything from our childhood, every argument, every eye roll, every backhanded compliment, began to reframe itself in my memory, like someone had just shifted the lighting on a portrait I'd been staring at for years, without realizing it had always been upside down. The fights we had as teenagers, the way she mocked my buzz cut the summer before boot camp, the way she rolled her eyes every time Mom asked me about the Navy, it all came from that same place, that festering well of disappointment that no one had ever addressed. Because Danielle had always been the one we weren't allowed to question, the one whose struggles were either minimized or ignored in favor of maintaining her pedestal. Melanie didn't stay long, just offered a vague apology, not for Danielle, but for everything, and then vanished back into the crowd, leaving me alone with this newfound understanding that felt less like a victory and more like a quiet unraveling of something that had been tightly wound for far too long. I wanted to be angry, to feel justified, to lean into that righteousness we sometimes cling to when old wounds are finally explained. But all I felt was tired. Tired of the competition I never signed up for. Tired of the narrative I'd been written into without my consent. Tired of a family dynamic that rewarded silence over sincerity. Later that evening, while standing by the edge of the patio where the smokers and the introverts took refuge, I heard my mother's voice before I saw her, that familiar hushed tone she used when she wasn't sure whether to be comforting or cautious. "You look good in that uniform," she said, her voice cracking slightly, betraying an emotion I hadn't seen from her since the day I shipped out. I turned to her slowly, not entirely sure if this was another attempt at backhanded diplomacy, but what I saw in her face wasn't judgment or restraint. It was regret, the kind that had been fermenting for years, but had finally reached the surface, bubbling up in her reddened eyes, and the way she clasped her hands so tightly, I thought they might bruise. "We should have said something," she admitted, "about Danielle, about everything. But we didn't know how. Your father, he thought it was best to let her be who she wanted to be, and when she couldn't be who you were, she just turned it all into resentment." I wanted to lash out, to tell her that silence isn't protection, that by refusing to address the obvious fractures in our family, they'd only made them deeper, but I couldn't muster the energy. So instead, I nodded once, the kind of nod that says, "I hear you," even if it doesn't say, "I forgive you." She reached out then, awkwardly, like she wasn't sure I'd accept the touch, and when her hand brushed my arm, I didn't pull away, not because it fixed anything, but because in that moment, something finally cracked open between us that had never been open before. When I walked back into the reception hall, the party had thinned out, and Danielle was nowhere in sight. I wondered where she'd gone, whether she was hiding in some back room unraveling or simply regrouping, reapplying her lipstick, rehearsing the next act of the performance. Whatever it was, I didn't follow. I'd spent too many years chasing her approval, trying to decode her behavior, trying to smooth over a dynamic that was never mine to fix. Now, with the truth floating just under the surface, visible but unsaid, I finally understood. It was never about the white blouse, or the dress blues, or the timing of my arrival. It was about the one truth she could never wear, that for all her perfection, she had built her identity in the shadow of something she couldn't become. And that shadow, it had finally learned to stand still and let itself be seen. By the time I stepped outside again, away from the dim lights of the reception hall and into the cool evening air, where the night had settled like a heavy blanket over the rolling Virginia hills, the last remnants of Danielle's carefully curated celebration were beginning to dissolve, not in a dramatic collapse, but in that slow, quiet unraveling that happens when people start collecting their purses, slipping on jackets, checking their watches, and subtly signaling to their companions that it's time to go. And as I watched the guests trickle toward their cars, laughing about dessert or travel plans or nothing at all, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing at the end of something far more significant than just a wedding. I wasn't hiding. I was just done being visible in a space that hadn't been mine to begin with. And even though the applause had faded and the conversations had shifted back to mundane things, I could still feel the aftershocks of the moment I walked into that room in my dress blues, like ripples in a pond that just keep spreading long after the stone sinks out of sight. I leaned against one of the porch railings, my arms crossed not in defense, but in quiet reflection, the fabric of my uniform still crisp, still heavy with the memories of who I'd been and what I'd carried to get here. Danielle found me there eventually. I heard the soft click of her heels on the wooden steps before I turned to see her. Still in her wedding dress, makeup slightly smudged around the corners of her eyes, hair less polished than it had been earlier, but she was still stunning, still poised, still every inch the woman the world had always praised. But this version of her, without the audience, without the curated spotlight, looked more real than I'd ever seen her. And maybe that was because, for the first time, there was no one left to impress. She stood there in silence for a few moments, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her veil, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, stripped of pretense, like she'd finally grown tired of rehearsing lines. "Do you know what it's like to spend your whole life being told you're special?" she began, her words slow and measured, only to find out that it doesn't matter the moment someone else walks into the room wearing something you could never earn. I didn't respond right away. There was no good answer, no version of the truth that didn't feel like a blade between the ribs, so I let her keep talking, because maybe what she needed wasn't validation or pity. Maybe what she needed was to finally speak the things she'd been choking on since we were teenagers. "I didn't care about the applause," she said, though I could tell she was lying and not very well. "It's not that, it's just, you come in here after all these years and everyone forgets about me, about my day, about everything I planned. And I know you didn't mean to. I know that, Kat. But it happened anyway." I turned to face her then, not angry, not smug, just honest. "I didn't come here to be seen, Danielle. I came because for once, I thought maybe we could just exist in the same place without trying to tear each other apart. I wore white because it was neutral. I changed because you asked me to. And the reason people stood up had nothing to do with me. It was about what that uniform means. Not to you, not to me, but to them." She blinked, her expression unreadable, and then said something I didn't expect. Something I'm still not sure I fully unpacked. "You didn't steal the spotlight, Kat. I threw it at you. I saw you standing there, quiet, understated, and I knew that if I didn't cut you down first, everyone else would lift you up. And I couldn't stand it, not after everything I've done to be seen." That confession hung between us like smoke, thick and suffocating, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was no apology, no cathartic hug, no dramatic reconciliation. Just the truth, raw and bitter, finally aired in the open after years of passive-aggressive smiles and silent resentment. I nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. "I didn't ask for the spotlight, Danielle, but maybe you never realized that trying to dim someone else's light doesn't make yours shine brighter. It just makes the whole room darker." She didn't respond. She just looked away, jaw tight, eyes distant, like she was holding back something she didn't know how to express. Grief, regret, shame, maybe all three. And after a long pause, she turned and walked back into the venue without another word, leaving me alone again with the night and everything it hadn't said. I didn't stay much longer. I didn't wait for goodbyes or hugs or the final round of toasts. I slipped out quietly, my shoes crunching softly on the gravel path, the moonlight casting long shadows across the empty fields. And as I reached my car, I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to make sense of my place in a family that only knew how to love things that sparkled. I thought about the silence I'd carried, the weight of my choices, the pain of never quite being enough in a house that only made room for one golden child. And then I thought about the applause, not because it validated me, not because it meant I'd won something, but because it had come without asking, because it had arrived the moment I stopped trying to be anything but who I was. Sometimes the most powerful kind of revenge isn't loud or cruel or dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up. It's putting on the thing that makes people uncomfortable because it reminds them of what they tried to forget. It's letting your truth be visible, even if it means someone else's illusion starts to crack. Danielle and I will probably never be close, and I've made peace with that. There are some relationships that don't heal, not because the wounds are too deep, but because the people holding the knives never learned how to set them down. But I will say this, when I left that night, I wasn't the one who looked small, and I wasn't the one who felt forgotten. She wanted a perfect wedding. She got one, just not the kind she planned. And as for me, I didn't take the spotlight. She gave it away the moment she tried to make me invisible. And in the end, maybe that's the part that will haunt her the most.